On June 17, 2020, scientists announced a discovery from inside Ireland's most famous ancient monument that sounded almost impossible. A man buried in the deepest chamber of New Grange, a passage tomb built more than 5,000 years ago, was not simply related to the people around him. His parents had been either full brother and sister or parent and child. The evidence was written across his entire genome. Long sections of DNA matched themselves in a pattern so extreme that researchers could rule out an ordinary cousin marriage. Whoever this man was, he had been born from a union that almost every human society has treated as forbidden. And yet he was placed in the most protected part of one of the largest and most carefully designed monuments in prehistoric Europe. At first, the discovery looked like a story about a hidden royal family. New Grange had required enormous labor, planning, stone transport, and religious authority. The man's DNA appeared to connect him with people buried in other major passage tombs more than 100 kilometers away. Some scientists argued that Ireland may have been ruled by a powerful sacred dynasty whose leaders copied the behavior later seen among Egyptian pharaohs and other god kings, keeping bloodlines inside the family to protect their status. But the DNA contained a second story that was even bigger. This man belonged to a population that had not always lived in Ireland. His ancestors had crossed the sea, arrived on the island roughly 6,000 years ago, and largely replaced the people already there. Then, only about 1,000 years after New Grange was built, another migration entered Ireland and transformed the population again. That is the real Irish DNA mystery. The people who built the great stone tombs were not the same people who had first survived on the island after the Ice Age, and the people living in Ireland today are not simply unchanged descendants of the New Grange builders. Modern Irish ancestry was created through repeated arrivals, disappearances, survival, and mixture. DNA has now revealed that Ireland's population was reshaped at least twice before written history even began. It has also shown that Vikings, settlers from Britain, famine, isolation, and ancient regional borders left smaller marks that can still be measured in living people. The result is not one pure Celtic bloodline stretching back forever. It is a far more dramatic story of an island repeatedly remade by people who crossed dangerous water and brought new lives with them. For centuries, Irish origin stories described the island as a land entered by a series of invading peoples. Medieval texts spoke of different groups arriving one after another, sometimes from Spain, sometimes from the eastern Mediterranean, and sometimes from places that mixed history with legend. Later writers searched for a single answer. Some believed the Irish were direct descendants of ancient Celts who entered during the Iron Age. Others imagined an almost untouched people who had remained isolated at Europe's western edge since the Stone Age. Surnames, language, red hair, music, and folklore were all used to build simple stories about ancient identity. The problem was that bones and artifacts could show when farming, metalwork, and burial customs changed, but they could not prove whether new ideas had arrived or new people had arrived with them. That question matters because culture can move without mass migration. A community can adopt farming from its neighbors without being replaced. Metal tools can spread through trade. A new style of pottery does not automatically mean a new population entered the country. For decades, archaeologists argued over whether Ireland's great changes were caused mainly by local people learning new skills or by large groups arriving from outside. Ancient DNA finally gave scientists a way to test the bodies themselves. The first major breakthrough came from the remains of a woman discovered near Belfast. She is known as the Ballynahatty woman, named after the place where she was found. She lived between approximately 3343 and 3020 BC, around 5,200 years ago. She was buried in a Neolithic tomb during a time when farming, permanent settlements, livestock, pottery, and large stone monuments had already appeared in Ireland. In 2015, researchers from Trinity College Dublin and Queen's University Belfast announced that they had sequenced her complete genome, together with DNA, from 3 men buried on Rathlin Island more than 1,000 years later. The result immediately destroyed the idea that Ireland's first farmers were simply local hunter-gatherers who had slowly changed their way of life. Ballynahatty's ancestry connected her to the early farming populations that had spread across Europe from the Near East. Her distant ancestors had roots among farming communities from Anatolia and the eastern Mediterranean. Those farmers moved through continental Europe over many generations, mixing with some local hunter-gatherers, before their descendants eventually reached the Atlantic edge. Genetically, the Ballynahatty woman was closer to other Neolithic farmers of Europe than to the Bronze Age men later found on Rathlin Island. This does not mean she personally traveled from Turkey to Ireland. Her family may have lived in Western Europe for many generations before reaching the island. But her genome showed that farming arrived with a major movement of people. Ireland's Neolithic revolution was not only a new technology, it was a population change. Before these farmers arrived, Ireland had been home to hunter-gatherer communities for thousands of years. After the last ice age, small groups entered an island covered in forest, lakes, rivers, and coastlines rich with fish and shellfish. They hunted wild animals, gathered plants, and moved through landscapes very different from the later farming countryside. Because Ireland was geographically isolated, these Mesolithic communities developed a genetic history that was distinct from groups elsewhere in Europe. The larger 2020 study of 44 ancient Irish genomes showed that the farming expansion into Ireland was rapid and strongly connected to movement by sea. The new arrivals largely displaced the earlier hunter-gatherer population, although the replacement was not absolute. Researchers found rare examples of local hunter-gatherer ancestry entering the farming population. That detail matters. It means the old population did not simply vanish in one violent moment. Some people survived, joined the newcomers, and passed fragments of their ancestry forward. But the overall genetic shift was so large that Neolithic Ireland was mainly populated by descendants of incoming farmers rather than by unchanged descendants of the first settlers. These new communities changed the island completely. They cleared forests, raised cattle and sheep, planted crops, built houses, and created tombs that required many people to work together. Over time, passage tombs appeared, including the great complexes at New Grange, Noath, and Douth in the Boyne Valley. New Grange was built around 3200 to 3000 BC, before the Great Pyramid of Giza. Its long passage was aligned so that sunlight from the winter solstice sunrise could reach the chamber deep inside the mound. The builders understood stone, engineering, seasons, and the movement of the sun with extraordinary precision. Then DNA revealed that the people buried in these monuments were not randomly selected. The man from New Grange was connected through distant biological relationships to people buried in other important passage tombs far to the west. Researchers also detected differences in diet and subtle genetic structure between some passage tomb individuals and the wider Neolithic population. These findings led to the theory that a powerful elite controlled sacred sites across Ireland. The first-degree incest result was the most shocking part. Children born from a brother-sister or parent-child union carry unusually long matching sections of DNA because their parents share so much of the same genome. This pattern is almost impossible to mistake. The researchers argued that such a union was unlikely to have happened secretly among ordinary people and then accidentally produced someone buried at the heart of New Grange. In known historical societies, officially accepted close incest has usually appeared among ruling families who claimed divine status. The marriage rules that applied to everyone else did not apply to them. But responsible science does not stop with the most dramatic interpretation. In 2025, a group of archaeologists published a critical re-examination of the evidence. They accepted the genetic fact that the new Grange man was the child of a first-degree union. They questioned whether this automatically proved that he was a king or part of a permanent royal dynasty. The exact bone was a small fragment, and the burial context is complicated because New Grange was used, disturbed, and studied over a very long period. Passage tomb burial may have been special without representing a stable ruling class like the pharaohs of Egypt. The latest debate, therefore, does not erase the DNA discovery. It reminds us that DNA can reveal biological relationships with great confidence, while social titles such as king, priest, or god remain interpretations. Even without calling him a king, the man inside New Grange proves that Neolithic Irish society was more complicated than a peaceful community of equal farmers. Someone born from a forbidden union was placed inside an extraordinary monument. His relatives were connected to other major sacred sites. The reason may have involved power, ritual, ancestry, or all three. His genome opened a door, but it did not tell us exactly what the people standing around his burial believed. For a short time, these Neolithic farmers seemed to be the obvious ancestors of modern Ireland. They had crossed the sea, built the monuments, and lived on the island for more than 1,000 years. Then the Rathlin Island Genomes delivered the second shock. The three Rathlin men lived between approximately 2026 and 1534 BC, during the Bronze Age. Their DNA was dramatically different from Ballynahatty's. They carried substantial ancestry connected to pastoral peoples from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the vast grassland north of the Black and Caspian Seas. Several centuries earlier, steppe-related groups had moved westward into Europe, mixing with local farming populations and helping create a massive demographic change across the continent. By the time their descendants reached Ireland, they had already combined steppe ancestry with ancestry from earlier European farmers and hunter-gatherers. The Rathlin men showed that this transformation reached the far western edge of Europe. They were not simply direct descendants of the people who built New Grange. A new population had entered Ireland during the 3rd millennium BC and changed the gene pool on a large scale. Their genomes were much closer to those of modern Irish, Scottish, and Welsh people than the Ballynahatty woman's genome was. This means that a large part of the ancestry seen in Ireland today had already become established by the Bronze Age, around 4,000 years ago. The change probably arrived with a wider movement associated with Beaker culture, new burial customs, metalworking, long-distance trade, and different social networks. But genetics cannot tell us whether every newcomer called themselves the same name or spoke one single language. It also cannot prove that they called themselves Celts. The word Celtic belongs mainly to later language and culture. The Bronze Age migrants may have carried early Indo-European speech that eventually contributed to Celtic languages, but DNA does not record words. What it proves is movement and ancestry, not the exact language spoken around a fire 4,000 years ago. The male lines were especially revealing. The Rathlin men carried forms of the Y chromosome lineage R1b, a lineage that later became extremely common in Western Europe and remains frequent among Irish men today. This does not mean every Irish man descends from only 3 individuals on Rathlin Island. It means those men belong to a wider incoming paternal population whose descendants expanded greatly during and after the Bronze Age. The ancient genomes also contained early versions of traits that would later become unusually common in Ireland. Researchers detected the allele linked to the ability to digest milk into adulthood in the Bronze Age samples. This ability would have been valuable in societies that depended heavily on cattle and dairy products, but it was not yet universal. Natural selection increased its frequency over many generations. The study also found the C282Y variant associated with hereditary hemochromatosis in both the Neolithic Ballynahatty woman and a Bronze Age individual. Ireland today has one of the world's highest frequencies of this iron-loading variant, sometimes sensationally called the Celtic curse. The ancient evidence shows that the mutation is old, but it does not prove it began in Ireland or that it belongs only to Celtic people. By the end of the Bronze Age, the basic foundation of the modern Irish genome was already visible. That does not mean Ireland became genetically frozen. Romans never conquered the island, but trade and movement continued. People crossed between Ireland, Britain, and continental Europe. Christianity connected Ireland to distant religious centers. Vikings arrived from Scandinavia beginning in the late 8th century. They attacked monasteries, created settlements, founded ports, traded, married, and stayed. Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Cork, and Limerick all developed through Viking activity. Modern DNA can detect part of this history. The Irish DNA Atlas examined people whose 4 grandparents came from the same local regions and found 10 geographically structured clusters. 7 were described as mainly Gaelic Irish, while 3 showed shared Irish-British ancestry. The genetic borders often followed old provinces and historical kingdoms, showing that geography and political boundaries shaped marriage for centuries. The researchers also found Norwegian-like ancestry and dated part of the mixture to the Viking period. The signal was real, but uneven. Viking genetic influence was not identical across Ireland, and some older Y chromosome studies found less Scandinavian ancestry than expected. The latest work therefore treats Viking ancestry as present, but complex, not as a simple replacement. Later migrations added new layers. The Norman invasion began in the 12th century, bringing settlers with ancestry connected to Britain and continental Europe. During the 16th and 17th centuries, English and Scottish settlers entered through the plantations. The genetic impact is especially visible in parts of Ulster, where modern studies detect a major barrier and a stronger connection with southwest Scotland and Britain. A 2025 study using thousands of Irish and British genomes again found subtle regional communities, an east to west and north to south pattern of British-related ancestry, and a long-standing migration route between northeast Ireland and southwest Scotland. This does not divide Ireland into separate biological races. The differences between regions are small. Most Irish people share the same broad, ancient ancestry, and individuals are far more complicated than a single regional label. But enough people married locally for long periods that modern genetics can still see the outlines of historical provinces, coastal connections, settlement areas, and isolated regions. In a strange way, the genome remembers maps that governments no longer use. The Great Famine in the 19th century created another demographic wound. More than 1 million people died, and many more emigrated. The famine did not create Irish DNA, but it changed which families remained on the island and which carried Irish ancestry abroad. Today, tens of millions of people across the United States, Canada, Britain, Australia, and other countries identify some Irish ancestry. Commercial DNA testing often gives these people a simple percentage, but the real history behind that percentage contains several different populations separated by thousands of years. An Irish result does not mean direct descent from one pure tribe. It usually reflects similarity to people in modern reference groups whose ancestry was shaped mainly during the Bronze Age, then modified by regional isolation and later migration. A person from Connacht may show subtle differences from someone with deep ancestry in Leinster or Ulster. Someone from a coastal town may carry more Scandinavian or British-related ancestry than a person from an isolated inland community. Yet all remain part of the same overlapping population history. This is why the phrase Irish DNA mystery solved must be understood carefully. Scientists have not discovered one gene that makes someone Irish. They have not proved every medieval legend or identified the exact first speaker of Gaelic. Ancient DNA has solved the major demographic outline. Ireland was settled after the Ice Age by hunter-gatherers. Around 6,000 years ago, farming communities with distant Near Eastern ancestry arrived by sea and transformed the population. They built the great Neolithic monuments. Around 4,500 years ago, people carrying major steppe-related ancestry entered and reshaped the island again. By the Bronze Age, a genetic profile much closer to modern Irish people had appeared. Vikings, Normans, Scottish and English settlers, local isolation, famine, and migration added later details. The mystery was never solved by finding one original Irish people. It was solved by discovering that there were several. The most emotional part of this story is what happened to the populations that left only small traces. Ireland's Mesolithic hunter-gatherers survived the cold Atlantic edge for thousands of years, yet most of their distinct ancestry disappeared after farmers arrived. The Neolithic farmers transformed the landscape and built monuments designed to survive time itself. But much of their ancestry was later overwhelmed by Bronze Age migration. New Grange remains standing, while the population that created it survives only as one layer inside later genomes. And still nothing was completely erased. Rare hunter-gatherer ancestry entered the farmer population. Neolithic ancestry remained inside the Bronze Age newcomers. Viking settlers became Irish. Norman families adopted Irish language and customs. Communities that arrived as outsiders became part of the island's identity. Population replacement in genetics rarely means that every person was killed or removed. It means the proportions changed so strongly that a new ancestry became dominant. Behind the statistics were marriages, conflicts, adoptions, alliances, disease, inequality, survival, and children who belonged to more than one world. That is what the man inside New Grange represents. His genome revealed a close family secret preserved for 5,000 years. But it also connected him to a much larger human movement that began far beyond Ireland. His farming ancestors had traveled across Europe. The people who later reshaped the island carried ancestry from even farther east. The Vikings crossed northern seas. The Irish diaspora later crossed the Atlantic in the opposite direction. Ireland looks isolated on a map, but its DNA proves it was never completely closed. The island stood at the western edge of Europe, yet wave after wave reached it. Each arrival believed it had entered a permanent home. Each generation built families, stories, borders, and identities. None could know that scientists, thousands of years later, would remove powder from a small piece of bone and reconstruct the journeys hidden inside it. The final result is more powerful than the old idea of a pure Celtic line. Modern Irish people are connected to ancient hunter-gatherers, early farmers, Bronze Age steppe descendants, Atlantic traders, Scandinavian Vikings, British settlers, and countless local communities whose names were never written down. The balance differs from region to region and person to person, but the story is shared. On June 17, 2020, the world focused on the shocking parents of one man buried inside New Grange. But the deeper discovery was not simply who his parents were. It was that even a monument built to defeat time could preserve only part of the people who created it. Their society changed. Their descendants mixed with newcomers. Their genetic world was transformed. The stones stayed in place. The people did not. And that is the truth Irish DNA finally revealed after 6,000 years.